everyone. Welcome to my first episode of my podcast, Educational Technology, Designing That Improves Learning. I'm very honored to have Dr. Karen Caldwell here with me. She's a professor here at SUNY Potsdam. I have previously taken her courses. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So before we get into some of these questions and topics, if you want to take a few moments to maybe introduce yourself to people who may not be familiar with you, give us a little bit background knowledge about your education and any experiences you've had.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. It's so nice to be chatting with you about topics that matter a lot to you and me and to many people listening, I
Mm-hmm.
hope. I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher and thinking like a teacher since I was age 5, and I am constantly trying to learn to be a better teacher. And so my current role is assistant professor at SUNY Potsdam, and I'm a program coordinator for the EdTech specialist, master's in education, as well as the master's in instructional design and EdTech. I was an online faculty fellow for about 5.5 years at SUNY Potsdam, and that was to support faculty in teaching online. And prior to that, I have a lengthy history in a number of different fields. I worked in business. I worked as the Trade Commissioner for Canada in education and training. I've been a house cleaner, and I've been mostly an educator in overseas contexts, in mostly with higher ed, but also teaching young Korean children in their diapers. So a really wide range of experience in the education world and a great deal of curiosity regarding how we learn and how we teach. And I'm aging, I'm 59, and I want to continue learning and learning with others and being a part of this incredible convergence that we're experiencing in the education world of different ways of understanding and some really big shifts that I'm feeling and seeing. So that's who I am. I'm from Canada, if you all haven't figured that out and
Mm-hmm.
about already. And yeah, that's primarily like in terms of my profession and who I am as a learner and a teacher. Hopefully that captured some of what brought me here today.
Definitely. I feel like you've seen probably so much and so many changes over the course of your experiences. So I'm excited to delve into some of that. So to start off, I'm going to kind of ask you what you think about ed tech. So when you hear the term educational technology, what's the first thing that comes to mind to you for you, or what does that mean to you as an educator?
Educational technology is made up of two massively important words. And I've had these conversations with your instructor, Dr. Tony Beatrice, who started this amazing program that you're a part of. And he's very thoughtful in his discussion of those two terms. And it's really two big circles that overlap. And so in our education world, we learn and we teach in formal environments. So primarily for the rest of this podcast, when I talk about learning and teaching, it's about in classrooms or in training programs in the workplace. It's not outside of those two worlds for the purposes of your focus today. And then the technology really is wide ranging. And if you ask Dr. Beatrice, he was part of a seminal book that defined technology, and this laptop, of course, is a traditional form of technology, but a book is a form of technology as well. So
Mhm.
I really think about things outside of my body that affect how I learn and how my students learn. All of those things are technologies, and yes, they have evolved incredibly over time.
Yeah. I was, like you were saying that, and I also think like my own experiences, like I started when I hear technology, I think the first thought, like you kind of mentioned, is like laptops, and it's just like so common now. But I remember when I was in grade school, I was like just first learning to type, and it was on a like small, compact, not digital, but not a typewriter. It was like the first of its kind. We got pulled into like what I would think is a focus group for students, and like that's just kind of how it started. So it is crazy that like think back to first and second grade, I was learning to type on this chunky machine, and now I have the access to the world on some of the smallest tablets. So, when I think about educational technology, it really has kind of vastly changed with the times. And
Absolutely.
as
And
we
what great experience you have with that as a learner as well.
Yeah, it's so funny to think back on, and just like what we're doing now versus how I learned, it's very different, but like again, we all learn. So as you said, you had a very diverse career: teacher, instructional designer, professor. How do you think this journey has shaped your understanding of technology, and how have you changed how you used it?
I will say, Sarah, based on what you just mentioned, I'm reminded of, I kind of use tool and technology synonymously. And I think of one of my great heroes in life, Jane Goodall, and how she sprang onto the scene by observing how animals use tools. Prior to her work, people separated animals from humans in that, oh, humans use tools, animals don't. Well, folks, we know animals use tools
Mm-hmm.
to survive. And so I think my wide-ranging experience with technology is kind of like this curiosity about how do I use a tool? How do others use tools? What's the effect? What does it take away from my experience? So I think about as a young person in the 1980s, a VCR, which is a machine that folks used to watch a movie on. I was the go-to person in my family. There are seven children, and I was the one who could figure out, also because I am very academic and I like reading things like manuals to figure things out. So problem solving and curiosity are parts of managing technology. So in that role, I've just looked at it as a tool. I was a banker and relied on technology. When banking turned from paper-based to digital, I was part of that experience as a teller primarily. And that was incredible to see how it shifted how we even interacted with customers. And then I also worked in telecommunications, first as a switchboard operator at a hospital, and then as a programmer and someone managing projects at the university where I was a student, but also a student worker, and I worked for telecommunications during the advent of internet and putting in high speed, or at least the digital technologies in the dorms, for example. So it's all been about this tool. How does it affect us? What does it change? And really at the core is curiosity and nowadays increasing skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so those are two words, I guess, curiosity primarily and emerging skepticism. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna actually talk a little bit about that too. I feel like there's a lot of like misconceptions about it sometimes. So
Hmm.
and then as a teacher, especially in like ed tech and with the creation of all these new things coming about, at what point did you realize that the technology should serve our learning or the pedagogy behind learning and not really the other way around?
I think this is important for everyone listening to stop and think about as well. Like, was there a transition in each of your processes and what triggered it? This is such a good question for me because I really began as an uncritical adopter of technology. I was living in Turkey at the time, and it was also serving me. It was one way to set me apart from other teachers and also for me to keep my employment. So it was like, ooh, that puts me in another pile.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, I took on more leadership roles in education. And as we began to measure teaching, I was going into classrooms, measuring what people were doing and seeing a list of criteria of how we were measuring teaching. One criterion was technology. And we had a lot of great debates about, well, this person didn't use technology in their lesson, therefore they got marked down. And that started to really make my brain itchy. And I shifted from this uncritical early adopter to slightly wondering, well, this is going to impact me later as well because I'm a teacher. And then it also turned to operationalizing teaching and learning because I took on roles and responsibilities and was measuring others. And then I have always been a learner, and I started my doctorate in my 50s, and I learned about things like operationalizing things. And that meant giving it a name and then a list of factors that are kind of like the ingredients of that thing. So I had to start thinking about teaching and that word effective in words like engagement and active learning. And as we operationalize those, technology was part of the mix as well. So going from uncritical to measuring to operationalizing teaching and learning has made me become still even more curious, but also skeptical about the role that technology plays, because these become very high stakes. Funding decisions and hiring and firing decisions are made based on a lot of these words that are not necessarily defined. And your use of technology with a special needs student may not be the best thing for that student, but you tick a box and score in that 5 out of 5 for something that may not be affecting the student in ways that, we're looking for. So that's how it has emerged for me. And it's about my own development now as a researcher and practitioner or teacher. And it's really about my increased literacy about what all of these overlapping elements mean, but also separately, what do they mean?
Yeah, we it's interesting because think about my own like teacher observation rubric after either we have the announced observation or like a pop-in. There is a technology column, but I believe from my understanding now that it won't affect you if you don't use it because like you kind of said it's not always going to be the best tool for the student, or they're going to pop in during a lesson, you're not utilizing it, and it's really not fair to kind of look at a teacher and being like, oh, well, you didn't use technology during this. But again, like you said, it just might not serve the purpose of what you're trying to teach. So I think that's a really good way to look at it. And as we spoke earlier, like I don't often utilize technology in my classroom. I've been doing it a lot more. But again, I think it's just because of the population I'm serving, it's not always the most effective digital tool at the moment. There are other ones that I think are a little bit better. So I think that's a really good way to look at it. And then this kind of leads us to like the science behind learning in digital environments. We talked a lot about it in our previous course. One of the things that always kind of stuck with me was that cognitive load theory. So how does the cognitive load theory apply to your online course design?
I will start. I just want to touch on the word you used that really resonated for me, Sarah, and that's purpose. And cognitive load theory really helps us to serve the purpose for our teaching and the learning. And so just to define terms, cognitive load theory from John Sweller helps us to understand the severe limitations of working memory, the unlimited capacity that we have in our long-term memory, and we really have not found the boundaries for our long-term memory, and also the roles that both of those capacities that we have play in learning and teaching. And cognitive load theory also labels different types of cognitive load of that really limited, narrow working memory that we have. We can call that our cognitive load, the energy we're spending processing new information that we're consciously processing. But we know that there's extraneous cognitive load and intrinsic cognitive load. And so we can use any tool at our disposal to manage that limited capacity and trying to lean more towards the intrinsic cognitive load and to eliminate extrinsic. And sometimes the technology itself, by its nature, is extrinsic, meaning it's additional, it doesn't serve learning, it detracts from your attention. And
Mm-hmm.
attention is an essential ingredient in learning. And technology in general, and a lot of educational technology, is building on this um, attention economy, I will say. Everybody is fighting for our attention, and we know now it's severely limited when we're learning consciously between 2 to 4 elements. So cognitive load theory really helps us to stop and think, well, wait, what is my purpose as a teacher working with one student or many students? What's the outcome I need to take them to lead them to facilitate by the end of this session. And so with that purpose in mind, I then think about, all right, I have to whittle it down to 2 to 4 elements they'll process. I have to eliminate extraneous load. And if I'm delivering learning through technical me or technology, which is, I teach asynchronously online, I have to think, wow, how can I think about managing my learner's attention when there are so many other factors at
Mhm.
play? So that's where cognitive load theory comes in for me typically. And I'm so glad just before this you mentioned purpose, because you shouldn't really plan or design or facilitate learning until you stop and think, what is the purpose? Um, and then the others kind of fall into place.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then we also talked about schema and how can schema development be supported through those digital tools?
So schema, I will just sort of loosely give a synonym of a mental model or a category of things, but our brains always look for patterns. And that's because we store information in our long-term memory in buckets or in these networked related chunks of information. So a schema is incredibly powerful in helping learners to process information, because you may have a group of learners, let's say 25 is the limit for our online courses at SUNY Potsdam. I have 25 different long-term memories that I'm facilitating learning for. Everybody has different background knowledge. So my starting point is the schema, and that is usually a visual or a model of some type where the new information will fit into.
Hmm.
And so schema are greatly facilitated with multimedia through images, keywords, labeling images especially, and the use of video to demonstrate if my schema that I'm teaching you is a process. Multimedia really helps us to depict the element of a flow chart, for example. That visual is much better communicated to you at the beginning through images and words rather than 3 epic novel paragraphs. So that's how multimedia helps me once I have set my purpose and thought about minimizing extraneous load and maximizing intrinsic load for those 2 to 4 elements. Then I think, what can I start with so that no matter what my learner's background knowledge is, we all have this common image that we're looking at. Even if it's a Venn diagram, it's a schema that shows here are our 2 topics and here's how they overlap. And we're going to focus on this overlap. So that way we're all on this starting point, and as my learners progress, they're using a lot of their visual spatial memory to manage that new information. So schema with multimedia, that's a really powerful combination.
Yeah, I remember like in class last semester, like you use videos, which was great because I do love to read, but sometimes you kind of just get lost in like a really long article and if there's few. So I think the mix of it is really good. And then, you did a lot of like callbacks almost like remember this and kind of built it into what we were learning that week. And I feel like that's a really great way to develop that learning process. And I think that was like very helpful. And then we're talked about a lot about like mastering online. We talked about feedback last year. So I know that a lot of online programs rely heavily on like learning management systems, the different platforms. So how can these systems support our mastery learning?
So mastery learning is important to define as well. And I will say that for me, mastery learning is about using measurement of learning in the service of closing any gaps so that the learner can master whatever that competency is. And again, we begin with our purpose. If it's here, and I measure my students and their, each one individually is here, then my focus is on this last gap and giving learners the opportunity to close that gap. So an LMS can only take us so far, and a learning management system, in my experience over 25 years or probably 30 now, is that it emphasizes management, not learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's been created by folks who don't have a background in learning and education. So you have to stop and think, okay, well, if it's about management, that's through data, learner analytics, for example. And again, so if that's what an LMS does well, then let's capitalize on that and use the data under the hood, so to speak, to inform those where those gaps are and where those strengths are. So you mentioned I do these callbacks, and that's through a tool called H5P that we've just had available to us this academic year at SUNY Potsdam, but it's more broadly being run at maybe 15 campuses at SUNY right now. And so H5P allows me to pose a question to you, Sarah, and then you answer the question. And it's regarding a topic that's relevant to what you're about to learn, but it's also something that I know should be a seed in your long-term memory because I've introduced it earlier. So when I pose the question to you and you answer, you get immediate feedback that is not just right or wrong, but also explains,
Mm-hmm.
yes, that's right. And this is what it means to what's coming up. Or, oh, you got it almost right. And here's what it means. So it's that exploiting the M of LMS because the M means let's gather lots of data so we make
Mm-hmm.
decisions. Well, those data should all be about learning. And then by the data you enter with your answer, it then branches off to the feedback. And it's that iterative loop that is a value added of an LMS. I can't do that as well in a classroom full of 25 adult learners. There are ways to do it. I'm not saying I can't, but it's just more efficient this way in that I can give it's almost like a personalized feedback by exploiting that M of an LMS, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
It does. It definitely does. And we talked about feedback. So how important of a role does feedback play in the digital world when you can use it correctly? Like to your learners, do you think I think it's necessary personally, because I remember doing those questions and thinking I was right. And then you did get that immediate feedback. And then it really did make you kind of think back. And I could be like, oh, you know what? Let me go touch back on that and see like where I maybe missed a gap. So I think you're going to say it's important, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
It is important almost all of the time, Sarah, and there's really interesting research findings that show that depending on your level of as a learner in my course, if you're farther along this expert novice continuum, if you're still a novice, that loop needs to be tighter. And it can't just stop at that one question I ask you at the beginning of the week. I have to be present when you get in a discussion forum and start talking about your take on it and you apply it a bit more broadly. So for folks listening, we begin a week with we call them knowledge checks in my courses. And then by the middle of the week, students share more about the topic. And so this feedback loop almost gets wider and more applied. But if I'm not present during your discussion to make sure that you're on track and you're accurate, then that initial feedback loop only takes us so far.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essential to think about it that way in terms of the learner support. On the other hand, if you're already closer to the expert end of the continuum, that immediate feedback is not as valuable. There's something called delayed feedback and intermittent feedback where you're not really sure when you're going to get that feedback. So it's really interesting in that probably if I had more time, I could design your knowledge checks that where it traces Sarah's progress based on how she's performing, and I would adjust it. Um, those tools likely exist, but either way, the feedback is not just in the form of immediate feedback in a multiple choice question, but my role as your facilitator, even if you don't see me there in a discussion forum, I'm there monitoring to try to steer things. And that feedback is equally important. And it's a different kind of qualitative type of feedback that students need at all levels. It's not just grad school, it's all levels. So it's the feedback loop that's part of everything an educator does. It's not a one and done um, effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I see feedback just even in my classroom too can and I do it immediately because it's what my students need. And like it's very interesting to see the difference in other classes. And even as a learner still at 32, like getting that immediate feedback is very helpful. And I think it makes you really reflect on what you're learning and kind of look back to fill up like those gaps, like I said. And then you kind of mentioned that if you had the ability, or there are probably tools out there to like individualize that learning, that feedback loop, kind of leads me to my next question is, do you think technology can effectively personalize learning?
My initial question, you sent me these questions ahead of time, and that was one I really struggled with because I personalized learning is a really massive, ill-defined concept, and it means different things to different people. So I want to hand back to you, Sarah, and ask you, could you give me an example of what you mean by personalized learning or a definition of what you're thinking of?
Hmm. That is, it is like when I was thinking of this question, I'm like, what I think personalized learning is, and I think now that I'm like kind of thinking about it, it is, especially maybe like I'm thinking more of an online learning. Unless you're one on one, it is really hard to make a system or a plan for a whole group to be personalized. I think, like you kind of said, if we had tools that could be used to personalize learning, it would make it a little bit easier. But again, that's still like a lot of workload. If you had 25 kids in your class and then you had to go in and personalize the learning, I think maybe in a perfect world, if you had a very much smaller constant cohort of maybe like 3 to 6 students, could it personalize? I think so. But I think in how, education is and in the grand scheme, like it is really hard to personalize it. I mean, even in the classroom I work, I have 4 special needs students, and they all have one-to-one learning, but there are still moments where maybe I do a group lesson or a group activity. And even as much as I try to make those accommodations and make it more centered to a kid, it is still very difficult.
Yeah, those are really helpful examples because it's not always in the student's best interests to accommodate every step of their journey
Mm-hmm.
because we know that learning is hard. Conscious learning, when done right, is difficult. We're spending energy that the brain is actively trying to conserve. We have evolved because we've conserved energy. Our bodies do that um, habitually, and our brains do that as well. And we have to acknowledge that learning can be slow, difficult, and require lots of practice. And so personalizing learning can happen and should happen. And yes, it's a lot more work. So I will tell you just some technical things that I do. I personalize my presence by using personal pronouns when I give instructions. And there are certain things you can do in a learning management system to use a code, so that when you open up a discussion forum or instructions, I can say, "Hi, Sarah, today you're going to do this." So I can put in this string where it says use the student's first name according to our records. So that's one way to personalize learning that does have an effect. But in terms of your performance, I keep an Excel spreadsheet and I write in each week what really stands out, something that you've done that I want to either comment on immediately and send you an email to say, wow, you blew me away with that. And I can't always share this publicly, but you made me think in this way. Or on the other end, a growth area that you have. So, but so far, I've not encountered a learning management system or any tech tool that helps me to gather that level of important information because Sarah's not a number to me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Sarah's not a percentage in a column, but I notice, like what you said in week one, what your credo was. You seem to be applying that in week eight, which is the middle of a semester where all of us are struggling to motivate ourselves. So if I can sometimes go back and at least acknowledge that I remember where you work, what town you're in, or what city, what you teach, what your credo might be, that's personalized learning that doesn't directly serve the learning outcome, but boy, does it connect us, which is really important for your learning. And there are lots of ways that Nowadays, there are tools that can do this thing called adaptive learning, where it's just a different path you take based on your answer. But that's not necessarily deep, meaningful, lasting learning. There are other processes at play, and I would have to see sort of the design under the hood to say that that is effective personalized learning. It might
Mhm.
be gamified, but that's not a synonym for effective learning.
Yeah, now that you kind of said your answer to that, I think when I think of personalized learning, I'm thinking of like I have to look at the data, I have to see maybe where they're struggling, and then personalize the next step or go back. But I think even just making those little personal connections is personalized learning because that is something we can control. I think a little bit easier as an educator or as an instruction, like an instruction in a class. But like you said, it is difficult to kind of go back and make everything super personalized. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. Just even those little personal remembering what they said or what they did, I think that helps really create those meaningful connections our students are looking for.
Yeah, I agree.
Before we go on to talking about like online learning, hybrid learning, I want to go back and touch on those misconceptions that we have about ed tech. When people hear technology in the classroom, I know that a lot of teachers, especially teachers that have been doing this forever and they're used to one way. And now I feel like within the last 3 years, there's been this really big explosion of, we see AI everywhere now and all these different platforms we're being introduced to and the new tools that are coming in. It is very overwhelming. So I just wanted to get some of your viewpoints on this. But what do you think the biggest misconceptions that maybe teachers or faculty have about those digital tools or educational technology?
I will say that the biggest misconception is that it, technology equals effective learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's an As with any innovation in any sector or world or discipline, just because it's new and used widely doesn't mean it's effective for your purposes. Again, you using the word purpose is really sticking with me today, Sarah. So I would say the uncritical adoption, also with the belief that, well, students are going to need this in their careers
Mm-hmm.
or when they leave this classroom. Um, I think that's a misconception. And I've just read this book and I'm about to read it a second time by Jared Cooney Horvath, and he's a neuroscientist and he's got a strong background in learner analytics and educational research and a lengthy history as a teacher. And one of the points that he makes is that a myth is that education is broken and technology can fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pervasive myth that sadly has done a lot of harm. And it's really this uncritical um, approach to technology.
Yeah, I feel I can see that. It's like I don't know, I think some teachers really look at it as a way to, I don't want to say fix learning per se, but I think they think it's going to help or maybe like create that connection with students. Like, because I feel like a lot of our younger students, obviously, they are growing up with technology already, whereas I feel like I didn't per se. I mean, like I did, but I had the TV and the DVD player, and then smart boards were introduced. So I think you have to shift as a teacher how you use technology in that classroom, and like as we have been saying, like the purpose of it. And so do you think there are situations where technology can maybe like harm or interfere with learning and not really be an asset per se?
Yes. And it's not just learning, it's in our psychological health, our interpersonal, our family health, our wellness. And there are a lot of findings now that are, showing without a doubt, like the really compelling evidence that it harms relationships. And a lot has to do with this attention economy and the emotional draw. So I would say the misuse of technology, because there's so many powerful um, opportunities uh, for the effective use of it. But I think a lot has to do with taking our attention and then controlling sort of social interaction through it. But for learning, um, I will say that good teaching with multimedia yields about the same results as teaching without multimedia. And that's been an ongoing debate since the 1980s. There was a great debate between two researchers, Richard Clark, and I forget the other gentleman's first name, but his family name is Kozma, Kozma. And Clark said that technology in education is no better than a truck delivering groceries in terms of the effect on nutrition. It's really about many other aspects. It's a tool and a delivery mechanism. So there is really compelling evidence, Sarah, and I really strongly recommend that people have a look at this book or go online and watch what he presented to the US Senate recently, because he's done longitudinal research across decades about this timeline where over a century, our IQ, for lack of a better word, our performance on tests has increased because of more schooling, stronger literacy, better nutrition, many other factors. But, schooling itself has really had this positive effect. But with the introduction of technology, if you put a line, and the increased use of technology in the classroom has shown a decline for the first time in our history over the last 20 years, especially since around 2010, 2012. And he cites data from three different international standardized tests, one being the PISA, and that's a test that 15-year-olds take in reading, writing, and science. And all of those scores are declining now. And the intersection is at the introduction of technology. And then on those tests, they also ask students, how much technology do you use in your classroom learning on a weekly basis? And there's a very strong correlation between increased tech use and test scores, decreased tech use and scores. And so correlation is not causation. We always have to make that point. And the findings are really compelling, that there is potential for harm with uncritical use of technology just for technology's sake.
Yeah, you made a really good point about like the social part of technology too. And I've had students like past and present that have this they have like, the unlimited access to the technology at home. And what I see at school is that attention is very hard to capture. I feel like I'm fighting against a force that I know I'll probably never win against. I am not as entertaining as YouTube and everything they watch. So like one thing I in my class with the iPads, they stay away unless it's something that I can control. I know a lot of kids want to, in like, my world, they like to work for iPad time, and I've kind of have taken that and decreased it and introduced more social rewards for them, which is like playing a board game, getting time to play with different toys in the room. And I feel like that has helped a lot because, I'm taking away that really potent thing and I'm trying to make myself more like don't know like more fun to them, I guess would be the way I want to say it. And but I can see when we come back from a long break or a weekend that there was probably a lot of time on unstructured technology
Mm.
use, and you can see it. So it's every week's I have to rebuild it with them. But that is a really great point, especially about like the social part of technology, because I think we kind of forget about that. And then my last question about the misconceptions is a lot of teachers, I've had teachers in the past take content and digitize it for online platforms, but they're not really designing it. So, what do you think, or what's your opinion on the difference between the digitizing of content versus the actual designing part of digital learning?
This is such a great question you've posed, Sarah. You could create a whole master's degree around it. So content is not learning, and a great worksheet is not necessarily better, digitized or in, hands-on. So I think your question starts with the importance of defining engagement and active learning, because we've all worked in environments where if the principal walks by my window and sees my students working in groups or in pairs or up and moving, there's a big check mark. That's active learning. They are engaged. And I think it's really important to extract learning from that until we have evidence that this actually is learning.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's with technology or putting me into pair work with another person just for the sake of saying, oh, I put the people in a professional development session in pairs. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to learning. So, um, digitizing content, in my experience, in taking so many different online programs as a learner, has primarily been a content dump. And that's my jam. I love learning when a professor tells me what they know and I can regurgitate it in an academic paper or however they want, and then I don't retain it over time.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that's digital or in person, it's not following the models and principles and research, primarily research, that informs us about how humans learn best.
Yeah, I feel like I remember teachers just like putting stuff on the board, like content, and instead of it being like maybe paper in front of us, it was now on the board. And I feel like they thought it was going to stick. And unfortunately, it always doesn't. I mean, some of it does, but I had a professor in I went I got my bachelor's in speech pathology, and I had a anatomy and physiology professor first year, and she just took the textbook and just made copies so that she could put it on the board. And there was really no active learning. It's a hard course to begin with. So when you have it just put up on a board, yeah, maybe it's on a smart board, so it seems more engaging. At the end of the day, it's not, because then she would just give us the copies of it. And it was reading like a thick textbook. So I feel like there's a very important, yeah, a very important difference between the two, putting up content and making it accessible versus actually designing something and seeing that active learning like you said.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, Sarah, that you mentioned another important expression, which is it didn't stick.
Mm.
And so I think at this point, it'll be helpful for me to define what learning is for me because I've been using it a
Yeah.
lot while we chatted. But learning for me is memory plus transfer.
Mm-hmm.
Memory is not a dirty word. Memorization is not a dirty word. Many folks imagine rote learning and repetition like robots as memorization, but committing something to memory is hard work and it happens over time with deep processing and sometimes shallow processing, but it's not a one and done choral repetition.
Mm-hmm.
We need content in long-term memory so that we can be creative, so that we can solve problems. We can't solve problems without any long-term memory to apply. And then there's the transfer element for truly deep learning. Anything that you learn, quote unquote, you have in your long-term memory in my course, you should be able to apply to not just one very narrow context. We can have near transfer, which is that narrow context, and then far transfer, which is more flexible use of what you have in your long-term memory. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you talked about was so important that they may have put it up in a different way, used different media, different modality, yet it did not stick. And there are reasons why. And for me, again, that learning is memory and transfer. Um, that's when you tick the box for me,
Yeah,
if you can
it's really
demonstrate
interesting you say that
that.
about memory, because I feel like there is a lot of um I think maybe like the word is misconception, or a lot of people now think that learning and memorizing isn't learning, but I feel like I do disagree as well. I remember in elementary school that like spelling, and it is essentially memorization, but the way the teacher did it, we had 5 days in a week. Mondays we wrote the word 3 times each. Tuesday we did one activity, and every activity blended into our spelling test by Friday. And I feel like it was memorization and it was rote learning, but in a meaningful way. That the words that I learned, I know how to spell them now, and it's not something we should be afraid of, but just know how to use it correctly. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, because there is a lot that we can't think a lot about how the
Mm-hmm.
word bot is spelled. It's we're
Yeah.
not going to use logic for those consonants in the middle. So sometimes I've got to commit this to memory, like our times tables. We may
Yeah.
not have math sense, but if I can multiply 6 and 7, I can manage at a market. I can solve a lot of
Right.
problems. But I don't need to know why 6 times 7 is
Yeah.
42.
Sometimes
And I hope I got
it's
that
easier
right.
to not think about the harder part of it and just know it.
Yeah.
So to go into a little bit more about the online learning, we talked about like the science behind it, some of the tools. Um, we have like you do asynchronous learning, synchronous learning online. What do you think the strength and weaknesses of either of them are? I know you do mainly asynchronous learning. So what do you think are the strengths of that, and maybe some of the weaknesses you've seen over the years?
Yeah, a lot of this comes up with what you and I have been talking about, Sarah. So synchronous learning is what you and I are doing in building this connection. I can see your face, your
Mm-hmm.
gestures, the expressions, and that is meaningful. There's some research, especially for young children, about the difference between seeing a face on a TV screen and then seeing that same face in the room with them. And there is a different level of learning, but we're not comparing that right now. And so it's the synchronous interaction that has emotional and social undertones where synchronous wins out. And I will say that I developed the deepest interpersonal relationships through online learning because of Zoom. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't make many friends as in my bachelor's degree or other degrees I took that were in person. They all came from distance learning where I could have these chats. So it's really this live human to human element that is the value added for synchronous. Asynchronous is also, I have to make the distinction when I teach, I think of learning is a synchronous event.
Mm-hmm.
Asynchronous is just the delivery mechanism, but when you log into Brightspace and go through activities I've designed, it's synchronous. So when I imagine my students like you and I'm designing, I'm thinking of your synchronous activity. And as long as we can make that distinction, asynchronous can be incredibly powerful with mechanisms like I described before, with those concept checks with quick questions and giving you immediate feedback, and then the follow up where you're applying it. So I can really stage things by controlling like the Wizard of Oz. I feel sometimes
Mm-hmm.
I'm behind the curtain. Like if I make this required, they can't open this until they do this, then I'm at least managing their attention. I'm a lot of when I'm managing asynchronous learning, I'm thinking about my student has about 6 or more tabs open. They have their cell phone beside them. They're hungry, they're tired, they have life going on around them. I need their attention. What can I do? And sometimes it's about micromanaging, and I'm not comfortable doing that. And I've got to suck it up. It's part of teaching asynchronously. It's to capture your attention and have you spend that limited working memory on what's most important. And so the asynchronous side of things is I can control the sequence of your learning, and I can be very transparent about your focus. And you know that in my courses, I have focus in all caps, and I have 2 to 4 elements in that list. And at least I'm trying to hand over to you that as you're about to read this chapter, you don't have to read the whole thing. I want you to focus on these 3 and 4 elements. And that seems to be easier asynchronously online than when I've taught in person, because I can see you in my classroom. I can see your eyes are open, but I can't really control what's going on internally. But in asynchronous, there's also the transient effect. And transience means it's on the screen in front of you and you can press pause and play and scroll. Whereas when I'm standing talking, you can't pause me most of the time, as you can see.
Mhm.
Um, and you're not able to manage your learning as well in person or even like live synchronously online. So that's really important too, is that the learner manages the scrolling, the pausing, the starting with the asynchronous. That's another value added.
Yeah. I like that from last semester where you were very specific in what we had to focus on. And it does actually make it a lot easier online with all the distractions we have around us. But knowing that you may be putting up, you know, 4 or 5 pages of something, but be like, you know, you don't have to read the whole thing, but make sure you're looking at these part. I think that definitely helps online learning. I've had professors in the past who will just, you know, be like, read the whole thing, but then ask one very specific question and you might have missed it. So it's nice to get that heads up, like, we're going to be focusing on this part. So please, at least if you're going to read, read this part for me. And
Adults need to know the
um,
purpose, right?
yeah, exactly. Do you ever think there is a time where synchronous sessions might be better? Or maybe do you think that's just like kind of dependent on the teacher or the topic of what the class is?
I don't have a lot of research or any fancy pants terms to
Yeah.
share right now, but I'm leaning towards asynchronous being stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that transience effect because when we're engaged in formal learning, it's conscious and it's tough
Yeah.
and it's slow and it requires practice. And we can do a lot of that live, but because so many people are managing so many other things, they need to be able to come back to that audio
Mm-hmm.
file or that reading and those questions. Whereas if it's all live, it's sort of a moving thing that you're trying to, oh, what did she just say? I was noting this down, but she just said something else. So I would lean towards the um, superiority overall, in my experience over my 59 years, that asynchronous is more superior because of how learning happens and all of those
Yeah.
other factors that you and I have been discussing and managing our attention.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a lot easier if things are presented to you and you go at your own pace and you can refer back. And there's, you know, we have to take notes, and sometimes you're taking notes on a video. The video is faster than what you can do. So being able to rewind or pause is great, whereas you can't sometimes do that in a live session. So I do agree with that viewpoint.
Yeah, maybe that's
Um,
personalized. That's maybe
yeah,
that's partly in that maybe you and I are widening our definition of personalized learning.
right. Yeah. I do personally, I would, those are my favorite classes. Being able to refer back and knowing that everything's right at your hands, where you don't
Yes.
have to rely on your memory, because sometimes your memory isn't the best. Mine hasn't always been. And then we to kind of start talking about like the tool integration of these like online classes. One of the questions I was thinking of was, you know, you said you do a lot over Zoom. A lot of your friendships, relationships have formed over, you know, using this tool. Have you ever designed maybe a Zoom session, whether for school or for any other educational purpose, that was more interactive in some ways? And do you think that works well when it seems to be more interactive?
Yeah, I immediately thought about my undergrad course. I taught human resource management. And especially when COVID hit, uh, I held classes through Zoom, and it really kicked my butt to think about how to engage students in deep learning synchronously. Because I realized pretty soon that when I taught in person, my students didn't have time, or for whatever reason, I just made the assumption it was time to do the reading or do the work before class. I just knew that wasn't happening. Same with before the Zoom session. So to make things interactive, I became much better at giving instructions and having things up on the screen again for that transience effect. So we would do an activity and I would do, I do, we do, you do
Mm-hmm.
process. So I would do it and think aloud and demonstrate the process. Then I would do one example together with the instructions up there. And then I would say, I'm going to give you X number of time to read this and come up with your own process. And I would give them the time. But what also was very important, Sarah, is to say, when we come back in 2 minutes, I'm going to nominate 3 students, but I wouldn't tell them who.
Mm.
So that was super important. And I think that's relevant no matter who your learner is,
Yeah.
honestly. I could be working with in an old folks home, and that matters. Um, so it was all about setting students up for success. I'm not a gotcha kind of educator where I want to catch anyone out, or it's about what can I do for that student to be successful when I release the reins slowly. Here's how I do it. Let's do one or two together. And I always have one in my back pocket. If I, after that we do part, I'll say, who would like another example? I have one ready so that a student doesn't feel like, oh, am I the only one that didn't get that? Because I'll say, I've already got one ready. In the past, other classes have wanted a second example. So no one's feeling awkward or vulnerable. And so it's really being over prepared, having very clear instructions up there, and always having an eye on what's the outcome, what's the purpose for this. By the end of this activity, what do students need to have achieved? And I found that was really helpful to utilize that Zoom session for the sharing my screen, but also just that live seeing me go through the process and then seeing everyone. So
Hmm.
it's about using gestures and embodied cognition, using the media itself, and then breakout rooms if need be. Those were really handy. And from time to time, I use polling,
Hmm.
or just the chat for people to chat in their answer. But really, underneath all that, whether it's in person or live online, making people be okay with being vulnerable. And I try to emphasize this is a no poser zone.
Hmm.
I try to have that in all of my criteria, but it takes a while. That I can't do on day one to have my students be vulnerable. But yeah, that's kind of
Yeah.
how I do live sessions, is making sure people are comfortable being wrong, because
Yeah.
as you know, it brings up so much more learning when we have a wrong answer to grapple with.
I agree. And I feel like that comfortable aspect is really important. People don't always love being on camera or learning that way. So I think creating a comfortable environment is like definitely a great first step when you're creating these like Zoom sessions. So that's definitely something I would keep in mind. And then we're talking about different tools. So when you're designing any of your courses, is there like a process when you decide what a digital tool to include? And is there a particular tool that you enjoy using more than others?
Yeah, I really do a cost benefit analysis, and the cost is my learner's cognitive load when they have to learn a new environment. And there's a really important, it sounds like jargon, but it's a really important term, and it's called the learning architecture. And you and I grew up in brick and mortar classrooms, and I could put you in a classroom in Cuba, and you could walk in and you could find the bathroom, the water fountain, the classroom, all of those things that are in every school, because we have this schema of a learning architecture of a brick and mortar school. But then you enter Brightspace and you enter Karen's course, and she has one learning architecture. And then you enter another course, and that's spending a lot of important working memory on stuff that should not be spent on the learning process. So I try to keep new tools. I used to introduce them in week one, and I learned the hard way that that's probably not best. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so first of all, I have to think, what do I lose uh, and what do I gain by having my students spend their cognitive load on learning this new architecture? And then I just go to research. What is this tool doing? What kind of learning is it engaging my students in? And then what does the research say? So if it's, I'm not um, criticizing gamification, but if it's gamification for the sake of capturing my students' attention, that's not sufficient for my purposes generally. It all depends on what happens after you have my students' attention. Um, so a tool that I want to recommend that helps me to explain this process is Perusall, which was created by a physics professor at Harvard who wanted his students to engage in active problem solving with each other prior to coming into his class with the physics textbook. So Perusall uses a type of learning called social annotation,
Mhm.
and it's about specific content and a student asking question about this physics equation or this passage in a poem. But it's real-time pointing and manipulating the same content. And Sarah comments, Karen answers, Jason follows up, and we're all talking about this very specific element. And originally it was set up for a flipped classroom. So if, Dr. Eric Mazer wanted students to have read and gone through these problems and tried to work together, then the value added is that when he's in the room during a lecture, he can clarify what he's already looked at online, where students were struggling, where also they didn't have any difficulty, and the great questions that emerged. So that to me was worth my students spending their cognitive load on because of this finer examination of specific content. And that includes video and audio content for students to pause the video and comment on this thing the speaker just said or demonstrated. And over time, students really appreciate it. Usually by the end of the course, they'll say, by the way, I wish we had done more perusal activities. Initially, though, it's not the case. So I have to be ready for my students to not be happy. And that I'm there. My role is not to make my students happy, but to help them achieve learning outcomes. And learning is hard, learning is slow, learning requires practice. And I'm not always going to be their favorite person as they go on that tough journey. So that is an example of how I go through that process of introducing my student to a new
Mhm.
learning architecture when they're just getting accustomed to Karen's course in Brightspace. Uh, so I don't enter those new worlds very easily or casually. It's usually a careful thought process.
Mhm. Yeah, I like the perusal last semester a lot. And I like that it was like we tried it in the first week without it being any, there's no like no stake in it, honestly. You kind of like you can try it, you can, then we did use it. And I did find it really interesting to like be able to interact on a different kind of platform almost. And then one of the things when I was like reading on your like your Weebly and stuff like that, you mentioned like a bring your own device learning environment. What do you think about that? And do you think that maybe mobile learning enhances attention? Do you think maybe it takes away a little bit?
I'm not a big fan. It was very much a part of that era, Sarah, in the late 2000s and then into the 20 teens, so to speak. It
Mm-hmm.
was really big internationally before we had a lot going on through laptops and yeah, in schools. And so it was a massive trend at that time. And again, it was all about attracting students' attention.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I didn't have the background I have today and the experience as a learner from cognitive science and neuroscience. And I didn't have the words to explain what my skepticism was at the time. But I now understand, you and I have talked about cognitive load theory and the role of attention. And the convenience was not enough of a value added uh, for what it took away from learning. And in those environments overseas, a lot of my work was for English as a foreign language. And by foreign, I mean even a different writing system and direction of writing. So the last 15 years were in um, environments where my students' first language was Arabic. And not only is it a different script, it's a very different grammar, punctuation, and
Mm-hmm.
direction. And not being able to manipulate language manually using our hands and using it on the screen, using a screen, whether it's a small screen, my device, or an iPad. Um, not being able to manipulate the materials and the language. It's really the language really detracted from learning. It really had a negative effect, especially for English as a foreign language. Um, I'm not a big fan. I like the option, the idea of choice.
Mm-hmm.
The BYOD, bring your own device, it's the another underlying element, but that doesn't mean the device itself is better. For me, BYOD, we should involve paper-based and
Mm-hmm.
tactile because analog outperforms digital.
It does. I agree. And kind of looking towards like our final questions here, maybe talk a little bit about the future of education. Since you work in higher ed mostly, do you think that higher education is getting it wrong when it comes to educational technology? Or do you think they're innovating effectively and thoughtfully for their students? Or do you find it to be more of a reactive, like, the introduction of AI? Are they doing it right by reacting to it? Or do you think it's kind of too quick of a reaction and they're not really looking at the whole picture yet?
Sarah, that's such an important question. And I think higher ed is not necessarily concerned with good teaching and learning. It's about subject matter expertise and
Mm-hmm.
forming people to prepare them for their role in a profession. And so one of my greatest frustrations is that these two worlds are not coexisting effectively. There's not a great overlap in the Venn diagram between subject matter expertise and over here, how do humans learn and teach best? And so technology feeds into that separation. So educators in higher ed don't receive training in how learning happens.
Mm-hmm.
And as technology is a tool of learning as well, not just delivery, that's part of that unfortunate situation. And so currently, one of the positives of the disruption of AI is that it's truly disrupting how we teach and learn because people have had to rethink this information dump and not enough personalization where I follow closely what Sarah's doing. Um, Not that folks didn't, but it wasn't always a priority
Mm-hmm.
because in higher ed, folks have to worry about their careers in terms of research, getting published, and many other elements. And in some cases, teaching is not the first criterion. So I think AI is disrupting us in positive ways, much like um, the COVID global pandemic disrupted us. And I always have this metaphor in mind. I've taught in our master's in management as well. And there's a change model by Lewin where the first phase is where we have to unfreeze. And that's
Mm-hmm.
deeply disruptive, cognitive dissonance, like, wow. So in COVID, it was who am I interpersonally? Do I need to be in person? I mean, it disrupted how we operate socially in many ways. AI is disrupting, it's unfreezing how education happens in higher ed. And the middle phase is change, which is also painful, but we have to because of AI is forcing our hand. Where that's going to take us, I'm not sure. In an ideal world, everyone will go to cognitive science, neuroscience, educational psychology,
Mm-hmm.
and find out, okay, so what are the conditions of learning? How can I use my subject matter expertise and teach others about it now? So that's the
Mm-hmm.
change bit. And then after that, it's refreeze. So unfreeze, change, refreeze is a really painful process.
Yeah.
So that's the positive of technology and disruption is that it's causing at least the unfreeze right now.
Mm-hmm. I think, like you were saying, that it's interesting from your viewpoint about like our professors or past professors that maybe didn't really think about the science of teaching behind it and how this change is kind of affecting it. I never really thought about it like that. So it's a very interesting way to think. And then, you just briefly touched upon like you have a lot of experience in different countries and outside of Canada and the US. So, do you think that there's a difference in educational technology globally? Um, and like, do you think that people can learn or institutions can learn from how maybe some United States institutions are teaching with technology? Or do you see a reverse? Do you see maybe somewhere else was doing technology right and we should really maybe follow their footsteps? I don't know if you see it one way or the other.
Yeah, I have seen the sort of this catch up with the United States living overseas. There's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of, well, what are they doing in the States? Therefore, we should do it. And that doesn't always work out well. But as it comes to technology, that what's more interesting to me is that the science of learning and cognitive science and neuroscience, primarily cognitive science and educational psychology, findings from those worlds as they relate to technology are informing systemic change in the United Kingdom and Australia at the country level. And in the states, for example, the state of Maryland, and some of the southern states, I believe it's Mississippi, um, there are changes afoot based on understanding how we learn and then adding in technology based on that rather than here's the bells and whistles, let's just dive in and be early adopters. And so the trend now that is I'm paying attention to is understanding how we learn and then technology's role in that.
Mm-hmm.
And but up until now, that what I've seen, and I do consulting as well, and I worked with a Singapore university just last year in a school district in California, so a wide range of folks. And like the technology is omnipresent, it's there. Other than maybe the global south and countries, developing countries, but still initiatives where folks spend money, it's often like, well, if these kids had iPads, then they could catch up with kids in the
Mm-hmm.
States where, so those decisions are still being made, but there is this emerging um, use case where they're using more research about how we learn and then thinking, okay, where does technology play a role?
Yeah, that's actually a really good way I feel like for people to think about it instead of just throwing the technology in, look at how it's been affecting us here almost, and use that to their advantage to make sure it is successful. So that is a really interesting way to think about it. And for our last few questions, just some advice that you would have for um, any emerging ed tech learners. What should aspiring instructional designers prioritize when they're designing their own learning experience? Do you think there's something that should always come first when they're creating something for others?
I guess depth of processing. So whether I'm reading a book or reading an online article. So when I say reading a book, I mean a paper-based book or reading the same version online. What is my depth of processing? And there's really interesting data about reading through the screen and an analog paper-based version. And we process more deeply when we use more of our bodies to process. So I would say think about depth of processing, processing being learning, learning
Mm-hmm.
being forming memories and being able to transfer and apply our knowledge and skills in flexible ways. But also, probably first and foremost, is have a model of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Inform yourself. What is learning for me? Therefore, how can I facilitate learning? And then how can technology enhance that or at least play a role? Um, but really, I think, yeah, having a model of learning, and I tend to follow Dan Willingham's simple memory model, which is related to cognitive load theory, but it's powerful because it's so generative. I can generate a lot of types of learning based on this simple
Mm-hmm.
model, and it's a schema that's based on over a century of research. So yeah, that's not a simple, straightforward answer, but if you think of
No.
depth of processing, learning being memory and transfer, and then having a model so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time you design.
Right. Yeah. And then I always kind of think about this question that if you could go back in time and you went back to, let's say you went back to school for teaching, if you could redesign teacher preparation for a more digital world, is there something you would include first or
Ooh,
make sure is included? Like, maybe they don't touch upon it now, but now that we're kind of doing it, like, is there something that should definitely be introduced to teachers?
I would say that a common understanding of what learning is based on quality research.
Mm-hmm.
I used to think, Sarah, that every teacher should be able to consume research and understand what quality research is and what isn't. I think that's far too much to expect a teacher. You're already tasked with the most important and tough job on planet Earth, to facilitate learning for a large number of humans is just enormous. But if it's learning you're facilitating, you need to know how it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would, I don't want to speak about SUNY Potsdam. I'm not speaking about SUNY Potsdam when I say this. In my own training, I did not learn about how we perform mentally, like cognitive science. I did not learn about it. I did not learn what's happening inside of my body, uh, but primarily cognitive science. And how memory is formed. I had to seek that out in my early 50s. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's essential to know how memory is formed and how learning happens in a very concrete level. And that's why I keep coming back to this model. Like if you have a model that is based on research, you have a solid starting point. So I would start with that. I think we need this in all teacher training and then concrete strategies. It's wonderful to be idealistic and to think about a sense of belonging and social emotional learning and all of these other important factors that affect learning. But there's only so much we can control in a classroom, and it should be built on a foundation of how humans learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I look back and I definitely I think they touch upon the science behind all how you learn, and there's some like words you're saying that are like hitting some old memories, but there's no real like course long process of how you're learning the working memory, like you're saying. Kind of get thrown into how to make lesson plans and how to, maybe you're getting strategies taught to you, but you're not really learning why you're learning these strategies or when it's appropriate to implement them. So I feel like you're saying, that science behind it is really important. And I think people forget that with technology, that there is still science behind that and we have to remember it. And it's very important that we keep both in mind.
Hmm.
Um, and my final question to you is, what gives you hope about the future of educational technology?
I would say access to learning. I find, Sarah, I've connected with so many world-renowned experts who they themselves are learning and
Mm-hmm.
curious and humble. And I have access to them. I can comment on a post that they make in Blue Sky or LinkedIn. I can email them and they answer me. And so it's access to expertise and to people who are interested in understanding how we learn and adding to this growing body of knowledge. And that's through technology. I couldn't reach these people without it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I can't reach my own students, and I get probably as much from them as I do experts because we have research, which is predictive, but then I'm in a classroom that is complex and has many moving parts. And then that changes the research. So it's this iterative cycle of theory tells us this and it predicts this behavior, but then I'm in the moment and other things are happening. So it's this combination of research and practice. Uh, and we just have many more opportunities to understand it because we can share the
Mm-hmm.
highs and lows and share data, but also this worked in this other classroom in California, but boy, it does not work with this community or on this day. Uh, so it's really access to information, but more the interaction that you get.
Yeah. I think that's a great point that we've opened up a world that we can create so many connections in to just better ourselves now. And the accessibility is a really big driving point behind educational technology. So I am looking forward to learning more and seeing how it can open even more doors than it already has. So it's definitely going to be an exciting journey. So,
Yeah. And there's
yeah.
a metaphor I want to share with you. There's a book by a Canadian um, author. She's a researcher and I'm not going to remember the words, but people who work with trees. So over her career, she's come up with this metaphor of the wood wide web, not the world wide web. And if you think about all the trees in a forest and their roots that we can't
Mm-hmm.
see, it's just like what we can't see under the hood and in our learners' bodies. But she talks about how messages are sent um, underground, where trees alert other trees of impending disease, but also they share nutrients. And that's
Mm-hmm.
how I see this connectivity that you and I have today. We're not in person, but we're sending messages and creating understanding that independently we have at this level, but you and I talking together have this level. And I like to think about it as trees nurturing and supporting each other and alerting and all of this. And I like the Wood Wide Web as a way of thinking of, yes, we have the internet, but it's humans driving this. And
Mm-hmm.
you said the word connections as well. That is, yeah, this is about connections as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end. I want to thank you for your time. This was a wonderful conversation. I think we opened a lot of doors. I think we had a great discussion. I'd like to thank anyone who listens to this, and I look forward to continuing these conversations later. Thank you so much, Karen.